Welcome back. In the last video we introduced arrays. In this video we're going to talk about some new things we can do with arrays. So we'll use the same array as last time, our guests array, where I just put 5 composers and some random ages for each one. And then last time we had a for loop and we went through each guest and we printed out the guest's age. That might be a lot of information. Remember, these arrays could be 2,000 or 2 million large. So what we're going to do this time is allow the user to type in a name, and then we'll search for that composer and print out the age. So I've added some keyboard input up at the top to get input from the user. I'm leaving out prompts and other things like that. And then I've cleared out the inside of the for loop. We've still got the outline of the for loop so that we can go through and look at each guest. But what we want to do with each guest is going to be different. We're not just going to print out their age. How we can do this is we can add an if statement. If, get the name of the current guest, so the guest at spot I, if their name, and I put contains, we could use equals or equals ignore case, but this way this lets us put in Mozart instead of having to type the full Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. So if the string contains the string we're looking for, then we've found our guest, and we're going to print out their age. Let's see this animation in action, and I apologize, the highlighting of the guests on the right side is not particularly ideal, but you can normally tell which one is correct. So we start by running our program. We get the input from the user. Let's say they type in Puccini. And so we start our for loop. I is equal to 0. That is essentially like highlighting the first guest. And then we'll see, well, does the guest at spot 0, does that contain the word Puccini? It doesn't, so we'll skip over the for loop. We'll go back around through our for loop. And now we're looking at the guest at spot 1. Does the guest at spot 1 contain the name Puccini? It does not. So we'll skip the if statement and we'll go back around. Now we're at guest 2. Does their name contain Puccini? It does. So we're going to print out their age. And then we'll just keep going through the rest of the for loop. Now we move to Mahler. Does Mahler contain Puccini? It doesn't. We move down to Bach. Does Bach contain Puccini? It doesn't. And now we're done. I is 5. And we continue with the rest of our program. Let's actually run this in Eclipse and see it in action. It's the exact same code. I've just added a little prompt at the top and then the name and the age to get a little bit nicer output. So if we're searching here and we'd like Puccini, we're going to get Puccini is 50 years old. It's going to have a few flaws because of our contains method. If I spell Puccini with different capitalization, it's not going to work. And there are a few ways to work around this. We could put the name to lowercase and then see if that contains name dot to lowercase. So now the guest's name will be converted just temporarily to lowercase, and the name we're searching for will be converted to lowercase. So now with everything in lowercase, it should work whether we spell Puccini with lowercase or all capitals or anything in between. This will actually cause problems with other character sets, other languages, but for English and related languages, it'll work just fine. The other problem is that contains might return a lot of results. Let's say I just type in A. Well, every single composer here has A in their name, so we're going to get a printout of all of them. That's not a huge problem, but it's just a little quirk of how the program will work. So now let's see if we can figure out who the oldest guest is. We're still going to need to go through our for loop and look at every single guest, since we can't figure out which one is oldest if we don't consider each of them. Let's start with a variable called oldest, and we'll set it equal to 0. We'll definitely find someone who's older than 0. And then each time through the for loop, if the guest we're looking at is older than the oldest guest, then we'll print out, hey, we found the oldest person. And we'll say, well, I need to remember how old they are now. So the oldest person is whatever that guest's age was. This has a bug here. Let's see if you can spot what's going on, what's not going to quite work. But this will almost work. All right, hopefully you spotted it. Let's see it in action and see what the problem is. So we're going to start by saying the oldest is 0, and then set I is equal to 0. So now we're looking at Mozart. Mozart's age, 31, is bigger than the oldest age. So we are going to set oldest to 31. We're going to print out Mozart is the oldest, and then we're going to go back around, and now we're going to look at Debussy. Debussy is 14, not older than 31, so we'll skip this, and now we'll look at Puccini. Puccini is 50. 50 is greater than 31, so we set our oldest equal to 50, and we're printing out Puccini as the oldest. And now maybe you're noticing the problem. We've already printed out that Mozart was the oldest. Now we're printing out Puccini as the oldest, but we can look at our array, and those two aren't actually the oldest. They're just the oldest we've seen so far. So the problem is actually that we don't want to print this out every single time we find someone older. We want to just wait and remember that name. And at the very end of our for loop, we want to print out their name. So let's try to do this a little differently. Instead of printing out their name, let's keep a variable called oldest guest. And whenever we find someone who's older than anyone we've seen so far, we'll say oldest guest is equal to that guest. So oldest guest equals guest at spot I. And then when we're all the way done, at the very end we'll print out blank is the oldest, and we'll use oldest guest's name. So this way, we'll wait until we've looked at every single person, and then we'll print out the oldest person we found. To think about this again, the for loop, as we're going through, is keeping track of who's the oldest person we've seen so far. And then once we've seen everybody, that person must be the oldest person in the entire array. If we look at this in Eclipse, we're going to see one small error. This oldest guest down here, it says may not have been initialized. And if you think about it, let's say we made a poor choice and we said, well, I'll assume somebody must be older than 100, and then we look through here and nobody was. It's possible that oldest guest never gets a value. We can get rid of the error by just setting this equal to null, which is a way of saying nothing here. We don't have an oldest guest, and that actually solves the problem down here. As long as we find someone older than 0, null will get replaced with an actual guest, and this program will work perfectly. So we run this, and we learn that Bach is the oldest. If we mess up, though, and we don't find anyone older than our default value, or no one is in the array, maybe it's an empty array, we're going to get this null pointer exception. So it's saying oldest guest still doesn't have any guest information in it, and we're going to get an error here. So we have to be a little bit careful with this, but this is a better way to approach our problem. It also has a great advantage where we have a guest object, so if we don't just want the name, maybe we want the age or some other information, we can get that here as well. So we can say oldest guest.getAge, oldest guest.getPhone number, and print out any information we want about our guest. And the last thing we're going to talk about today is a variation of the for loop called a for each loop. This exists because we use for loops so frequently to walk through an array and look at every single item in the array that Java just wanted to make it a little bit easier to write and use. So with a for each loop, what we do is instead of saying I equals 0, I is less than guest.length, and so on, we create a variable. I called it curGuest for current guest, and we say that that variable should walk through the guest's array. So that colon on the left side is the variable that's going to refer to one guest at a time, and on the right side is the array that we're going to walk through. And then inside the for loop, instead of saying guests at spot I, we just say current guest. So current guest.getAge, oldest guest equals current guest, and so on. So this is just a little bit shorter to write out. We don't end up having to write guests at spot I every single time. And it just really clearly says we're going to walk through this array. Let's see this in action because it's a little confusing. So we're going to start with oldest equals 0, just like before. We're going to create an oldest guest variable and set it equal to null. So right now it's not referring to any guest. And we're going to say for current guest through the guests array. So each time through the loop, our current guest will be a different person in the guests array. Right now it'll start at the first guest, and we'll say, well, are they older than the oldest? They are, so we'll go in here. Oldest becomes 31, the current age, and oldest guest now refers to Mozart. And we'll go back through our for loop. Second time through our for loop, our current guest is now the second person in there, WC. WC is not older than our oldest person, so we'll skip through and come back around. The third time through our for loop, our current guest, you can see Puccini highlighted. Puccini's age is higher than 31, so we'll put 50 in oldest, and we'll now have oldest guest point to Puccini. Our next current guest is Mahler. His age is not oldest, so we'll go back through, and our last guest here is Bach. Bach's age is bigger than the oldest age, so oldest becomes 62. Oldest guest points to Bach. We go back through and our for loop is done. We're not referring to any guest anymore. So we'll continue on with our code and we'll print out, in this case, Bach is the oldest.